I'm Ben.
And I'm Al, and today we're going to make your combats in D&D 5e more interesting.
Of the three pillars of gameplay in D&D, combat is often the biggest. And since we spend so much time at the table rolling dice and killing goblins, it is important to make sure that everyone at the table is engaged and excited for this part of the game. Too often do I see inexperienced DMs and players overlook the storytelling potential innate in combat. And so we wanted to discuss what you can do both as a DM and as a player to make combat more engaging and exciting.
The first thing to make your combats more interesting is using terrain to your advantage. Far too many DMs, myself included, have thrown players in a combat that is basically just an open field in a forest or what have you. But terrain can really be your best friend when creating encounters that are both engaging and exciting. I think this often happens because you have to quickly think of a scenario if you are rolling with random encounter tables or you want to break up the monotony of an adventure. And a lot of times that happens, it's in a forest. And sometimes it can be hard to think off the top of your head an interesting location in a forest other than like a clearing or a bunch of trees. But adding a cliff or a roaring river or maybe even a bridge between a canyon can really amp up the potential to your combats. And the potential only gets greater when you start throwing in man-made structures. Maybe there's a rickety watchtower that is blowing in the wind, or a castle fortress that has archers on the top that really add a dynamic to your encounters.
The trick that I use the most, and I personally find the simplest, is elevation. It adds such a dynamic to play. Either pillars that break up line of sight for casters or ranged attackers, or raised cliffs that your baddies can be positioned on that fire down on your foes, things to climb up or push people over. These are all very simple ways to really get your players thinking about the terrain as part of the battlefield. Once you're ready to take the step up from this, I highly suggest dynamic terrain, or terrain that can be affected by the battle. If there is a rickety watchtower, perhaps the barbarian is able to tip it over and totally decimate the archers in it without even needing to attack them. Maybe you are in a puzzle dungeon that uses beams of light as part of the puzzle. But your party can also use that for a combat encounter that pops in that room. If your party needs to move for reasons other than getting to the bad guys, your battleground is going to feel really alive as they are dodging hazards and then closing in on foes to need to dodge out of the way of another hazard before they take damage.
I think the greatest part and one of the most interesting things about terrain is it is a neutral party in a battle. So not only can your players take advantage of these things or the bad guys, but they both have the opportunity to interact with this terrain and get an advantage for themselves on the battlefield. And if your players aren't taking advantage of those things, like the rope bridge across the canyon, you can have the bad guys start sawing the rope to try to get that upper hand. That's going to add a level of dynamicism to the battle that is really going to help engage your players, because now they not only have to kill the enemies, but they have a secondary problem to solve. And when it comes to terrain in combat, I think an honorable mention needs to be addressed to traps. Traps are a really great way to add this dynamic terrain to your combat. If you walk into this water temple and now you engage a room full of Triton and they start turning a wheel and water begins to fill the room, not only can your party try to interact with that, stop the Triton from opening it or close it themselves, but they also have a timer that is causing them to have not only a secondary objective, but a time limit on the battle other than the sacks of hit points that are sitting in front of them.
While there is always merit to the battle that happens in an open field or the simple dungeon that doesn't have a lot going on, I am at a point now where the very first thing I think about when I do my combat encounters is what the battlefield looks like. Because once you are able to properly utilize that for your combats, you will never be in a situation where one fight is the same as another, because the location of the fight is just as important as the things they're fighting.
And that's something that's really helpful to note. It can be really useful to think about interesting terrain features that can be interacted with, but don't be afraid to throw in a couple objects that you have no idea how they could be useful. You'd be surprised at how much use a party of creative adventurers can get out of just a pile of sticks that you threw in, not anticipating it for combat. And along those very same lines, don't be afraid to encourage your players to ask, hey, is there a rope hanging from the ceiling that I can use to cross this gap? Or what have you, because you want to encourage their creativity so they can add to the fleshing out of the battle zone to make it more dynamic.
And actually, my favorite part about adding secondary objectives to combat is that you sort of sprinkle in other pillars of play into combat. You allow the skill monkey to feel really effective and important and useful in combat, even though they maybe didn't take a whole lot of damaging spells. Meanwhile, the barbarian still gets to feel super important in this skill challenge because they're fighting all of the bad guys who would be preventing our skill monkey from opening this safe.
And when formulating these secondary objectives, don't be afraid to make it something that demands to be dealt with as soon as possible. Maybe a group of necromancers are creating some sort of ritual, and if they succeed, there's going to be a huge demon right at your front doorstep. Or maybe there's this giant pool of ooze where ooze warriors are coming out one by one every round and just adding to the fight. And your PCs have to deal with it or they are going to quickly be outnumbered.
I actually think that Ooze example is great because there can be a problem when adding secondary objectives where the secondary objective gets completed midway through the fight and then the party sees no reason to not continue the fight, so it just ends up into killing people anyways. But the ooze example is nice because theoretically, if you deal with the big pile of ooze, you could have all the ooze warriors that were created die, ending the fight.
Another thing that I find really engaging in combat is when you add a timer to the table. I think it's really fun when the DM lowers the screen, throws a D8, and says, this is how many rounds you have until the room fills with poisonous smoke. And now you have a set amount of time to achieve your primary and or secondary objective, and there's a lot of drama that comes with this timer.
And with timers, I think it is important to set fail states, as with anything in Dungeons & Dragons. So if the room is filling with poison, perhaps after a certain amount of rounds, everybody suffers from the poisoned condition. And then after that, they start suffering levels of exhaustion until they eventually die from it. This is not only a soft warning as a DM saying, hey, you guys need to deal with this pretty quickly because it's getting pretty bad pretty fast, but it also raises the stakes every time you add one of those on, as it's a new challenge for the party to have to reconcile with and deal with, while also dealing with the main threat.
Another place I see people trip up is varying their monsters, not only between instances of combat, but in the same exact combat. I know personally when I am scrambling to prep for a D&D session, it can be really, really enticing to just throw 10 skeletons and call it a day. But adding 3 goblins that are riding wolves and then a couple goblin archers in the back really change the flow of combat and gives players choices on who to target. Along those very same lines, you're going to want to choose monsters that incorporate well together. In that same example that I was talking about, having the wolves run up, trip the party members, and then have the archers hold their actions for when they stand up can be really compelling because it throws the party off guard and it shows that these goblins are coordinated for whatever reason, which really adds to the narrative of the fight.
Unfortunately, 5e does not have the same role system for monsters that 4th edition had, but you can still kind of operate under the same principles with brutes and skirmishers, artillerists and controllers, looking at stat blocks and seeing, oh, this druid stat block has spike growth. So if I couple that with a couple gladiators, then I am able to lock down the party and force them to deal with the gladiators, while the controller, druid, stays in back and keeps casting spells. Something else that I think is really important with this is to make sure that your monsters are using their abilities to the best of their abilities. There are all sorts of resources online with people talking tactics about how their monsters could fight, but one of the most compelling ones that I have found is actually this book right here. I promise we're not sponsored, but this book right here, The Monsters Know What They're Doing. It goes through all of the monsters in the monster manual and breaks down not only their sort of character archetype, but also their D&D stats, and gives you inspiration for encounters for those monsters, and also just goes through their abilities to kind of help you through how those would be best utilized by those combatants.
I think a super quick and easy way you can shove a dynamic choice for your players in combat is having a support monster and a main monster. Having that choice of, okay, do we take care of the dude that's buffing the main guy, or do we take care of the main guy and then the other dude is going to be super easy to deal with? I think that's a super common choice that we see in a lot of games, and it's perfect for D&D 5e, because what we're trying to encourage here is not only trying to encourage your players to use their actions in dynamic ways, but also to give them interesting choices during combat, so the obvious choice isn't just to run up to the biggest guy and start whacking until he's dead.
So all of that are kind of crunchy, more rules-based ways to add dynamic combat to your table. But there is another very important aspect of D&D's combat system that really adds that layer to it, and that is storytelling. Your combats need to tell some kind of story. I mean, that's what we're all there at the table to do, and it shouldn't break just because we all rolled for initiative.
In my experience, if a game doesn't have a lot of role play during combat, I switch my brain to the combat mode where it's all numbers and trying to optimally do the best thing possible. And I think that's true for DMs especially, making sure that everybody gets their turn in the correct order and all the monster numbers and the hit points you're tracking. But having your BBEG or even his cronies talk to the players during combat can really help them get into that mindset that we're not just in combat now. There's still also potential for that social pillar as well as the exploration pillar. I think that's something that's really important to incorporate, is combat isn't just combat. It still has those other elements to the game.
When you're running as a DM, I think it's important to remember the characterization of the baddies that you are controlling. Orcs will fight differently from goblins, will fight differently from mind flayers. If you're not a DM who really likes doing the one-liner thing in combat, another simple trick you can use to help your fights feel like they have a flow to them is descriptions of the battle, and that'll really help find a flow. Maybe the orcs that the party is fighting are really cocky and confident in the beginning, but as the battle starts turning and orcs start falling, you see the desperation sort of fall over them more. The simplest trick I have for this is that for hit points, usually when damage is being dealt to my monsters before they are bloodied, I describe it as either very close blocks or things that hit armor but didn't quite penetrate. But then when they get bloodied, that's when the blows actually start landing. And when I say bloodied, I mean below half hit points. And I think that really is such a quick and tiny little thing, but really shows that the party is having an effect on these things as they're fighting them. And it also reminds me as a DM too, like, oh, this guy just got bloodied. He actually got hit. He's going to be fighting a little bit more desperately now that his armor has been carved away and he's vulnerable.
I think detailed descriptions are really important, but I also wouldn't overdo it in combat. If you're just taking long, swarthy paragraphs about how the monster is doing, the players are going to get antsy and start checking out. That's something else I want to touch on, is if a combat is going particularly long, especially if you're adding all this dynamic dialogue and descriptions, I wouldn't be afraid to cut it short if the tide has turned. If there's only 2 measly goblins left from the original band of 15, and you know your players are gonna win, either have them surrender or narrate how the goblins fell, or allow your players to do the same. I wouldn't cling on to the turn-based system so desperately just to see if the goblin got a couple more hit points or the wizard cast another spell. I think it's important to keep the flow of the game going, and if it's been a long, hard combat, allow them to have a really cool, triumphant victory description rather than just rolling to hit, okay, I hit, now he's dead. And just waiting for that to happen, especially if everybody is tired of the long combat. That being said, I wouldn't just hand wave, the enemies ran away, especially if your players are winning, because 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10 times out of 10, the players are going to chase them. So I wouldn't narrate that unless you're willing to run that chase sequence.
This responsibility for narration and description, though, does not only fall on the DM, and I think as a DM, it can be important to create a space where your players feel comfortable describing their own attacks and spells. It is so important to remember that this is a cooperative storytelling experience. So players, be willing to describe the flavor of your spells, or if your ally falls down and you go to cure wounds on them, say that you grab their hand and pull them up and say some one-liner to them. And D&D is a power fantasy for a lot of people, but as far as the story is concerned, don't be afraid to show your character getting beaten up or getting afraid of the fight and getting worried about what might happen, because then when the tides turn and you beat the enemy, that is just going to make the victory that much richer. I mean, just looking at examples of fights in movies and TV, which are great inspirations when you're thinking about describing your combats. It is way more interesting to see our heroes get beat up and battered and then win it right at the last second than have them just beating the crap out of the bad guys. The bad guys can't do anything about it and they just get creamed.
Another thing you can do as a player is when you drop to 0 hit points, don't just say, now I'm dying, or I've fallen unconscious. If your DM will allow you, take the narrative for a moment and make it very dramatic. Say that your character is about to cast one of their last spells and they fall.
Of the 3 pillars of play, combat has the most rules and literal pages of the handbooks dedicated to it. It is a big part of the D&D experience, and one that can be exciting, engaging, and help continue the story that you are trying to tell. This is best done through interesting use of terrain, secondary objectives besides just killing the bad guys, and the narrative things that you can do to keep the flow of the storytelling and the RPG aspect of D&D still in play during combat.
If you've gotten this far in the video, I just wanted to say a huge thank you. If you want to help out the channel, you can leave a comment down below or leave a like on the video. And if you really like the content we're doing here, you could consider subscribing. If you're looking for a way to monetarily add value to the channel, you can consider supporting us on Patreon. Speaking of which, our June patrons are Faizan Ahmad, Painted Sky, and Robert Allen Klaus III. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you on your next short rest.